The White Knight, Part 1. The night of the 16th of February, 1833, was a blessed night. Above its shade the heavens were opened. It was the wedding night of Marius and Cosette. The day had been adorable. It rained that day, but there is always a little patch of blue in the sky at the service of happiness, which lovers see, even though the rest of creation be under an umbrella. On the previous evening, Jean Valjean had handed to Marius, in the presence of Monsieur Gillenormand, the 584,000 francs. There was a beautiful room in the Gillenormand house, furnished expressly for him, and Cosette had said to him so irresistibly, "Father, I pray you," that she had made him almost promise that he would come and occupy it. To realize his dream, to whom is that given? There must be elections for that in heaven. We are all unconscious candidates. The angels vote. Cosette and Marius had been elected. Cosette at the mairie and in the church was brilliant and touching. Toussaint, aided by Nicolette, had dressed her. Marius' beautiful hair was perfumed and lustrous. Here and there might be discerned, under the thickness of the locks, pallid lines which were the scars of the barricade. The grandfather, superb, his head held high, uniting more than ever in his toilet and manner all the elegancies of the time of Barras, conducted Cosette. When, at the completion of all the ceremonies, after having pronounced before the mayor and the priest every possible yes, after having signed the registers at the municipality and at the sacristy, after having exchanged their rings, after having been on their knees, elbow to elbow, under the canopy of white moire, in the smoke of the censer, hand in hand, admired and envied by all, Marius in black, she in white, preceded by the usher in colonel's epaulets, striking the pavement with his halberd. Between two hedges of marvelling spectators, they arrived under the portal of the church, where the folding doors were both open, ready to get in the carriage again, and all was over. Cosette could not yet believe it. She beheld Marius in glory. Marius beheld Cosette upon an altar, and upon that altar, and in that glory, the two apotheoses mingling. In the background, mysteriously, behind a cloud to Cosette, in flashing flame to Marius, there was the ideal, the real, the rendezvous of the kiss and the dream, the nuptial pillow. Then they returned to the Rue du Calvaire, to their home. Marius, side by side with Cosette, ascended, triumphant and radiant, that staircase up which he had been carried dying. The poor gathered before the door, and sharing their purses, they blessed them. A banquet had been prepared in the dining room. In the antechamber, 3 violins and a flute played some of Haydn's quartets in softened strains. Jean Valjean sat in a chair in the parlor behind the door, which shut back upon him in such a way as almost to hide him. A few moments before, they took their seats at the table. Cosette came, as if from a sudden impulse, and made him a low curtsy, spreading out her bridal dress with both hands, and, with a tenderly frolicsome look, she asked him, "Father, are you pleased?" "Yes," said Jean Valjean, "I am pleased." "Well then, laugh." Jean Valjean began to laugh. A few moments afterward, Basque announced dinner. The guests, preceded by Monsieur Gillenormand, giving his arm to Cosette, entered the dining room, and took their places according to the appointed order about the table. 2 large armchairs were placed, on the right and the left of the bride, the first for Monsieur Gillenormand, the second for Jean Valjean. Monsieur Gillenormand took his seat. The other armchair remained empty. All eyes sought Monsieur Fauchelevent. He was not there. Monsieur Gillenormand called Basque. "Do you know where Monsieur Fauchelevent is?" "Monsieur," answered Basque. "Exactly. Monsieur Fauchelevent told me to say that Monsieur was suffering a little from his sore hand, and could not dine with Monsieur the Baron and Madame the Baroness. That he begged that they would excuse him. That he would come tomorrow morning. He's just gone away." The empty armchair chilled for a moment the effusion of the nuptial repast. But what is one dark corner in such a deluge of joy? Cosette and Marius were in one of those selfish and blessed moments where we have no faculties save for the perception of happiness. Marius took Jean Valjean's place at Cosette's side, and things arranged themselves in such a way that Cosette, at first saddened by Jean Valjean's absence, was finally satisfied with it. From the moment that Marius was the substitute, Cosette would not have regretted God. She put her soft little foot, encased in white satin, upon Marius' foot. The armchair occupied, Monsieur Fauchelevent was effaced, and nothing was missed. And 5 minutes later, the whole table was laughing from one end to the other with all the spirit of forgetfulness. The evening was lively, gay, delightful. The sovereign good humour of the grandfather gave the keynote to the whole festival, and everybody regulated by himself this almost centenarian cordiality. They danced a little, they laughed much. It was a good childlike wedding. They might have invited the good man formally. Indeed, he was there in the person of Grandfather Gillenormand. There was a tumult, then silence. The bride and groom disappeared. A little after midnight, the Gillenormand house became a temple. Here we stop. Upon this threshold of wedding nights stands an angel smiling, his finger on his lip. The soul enters into contemplation before this sanctuary, in which is held the celebration of love. There must be gleams of light above those houses. The joy which they contain must escape in light through the stones of the walls, and shine dimly into the darkness. It is impossible that this sacred festival of destiny should not send a celestial radiation to the infinite. Love is the sublime crucible in which is consummated the fusion of man and woman. The one being, the triple being, the final being, the human trinity springs from it. This birth of two souls into one must be an emotion for space. The lover is priest. The rapt maiden is affrighted. Something of this joy goes to God. Where there is really marriage, that is, where there is love, the ideal is mingled with it. A nuptial bed makes a halo in the darkness. Were it given to the eye of flesh to perceive the fearful and enchanting sights of the superior life, it is probable that we should see the forms of night, the winged strangers, the blue travellers of the invisible, bending, a throng of shadowy heads over the luminous house, pleased, blessing, showing to one another the sweetly startled maiden bride, and wearing their reflection of the human felicity upon their divine countenances. If at that supreme hour the wedded pair, bewildered with pleasure, and believing themselves alone, were to listen, they would hear in their chamber a rustling of confused wings. Perfect happiness implies the solidarity of the angels. That little obscure alcove has for its ceiling the whole heavens. When two mouths made sacred by love draw near to each other to create, it is impossible that above that ineffable kiss there should not be a thrill in the immense mystery of the stars. These are the true felicities. No joy beyond these joys. Love is the only ecstasy. Everything else weeps. To love, or to have loved, that is enough. Ask nothing further. There is no other pearl to be found in the dark folds of life. To love is a consummation. Part 2. What had become of Jean Valjean? Immediately after having laughed, upon Cosette's playful injunction, nobody observing him, Jean Valjean had left his seat, got up, and, unperceived, had reached the antechamber. It was that same room which he had entered 8 months before, black with mire, blood, and powder, bringing the grandson home to the grandfather. The old woodwork was garlanded with leaves and flowers. The musicians were seated on the couch upon which they placed Marius. Basque, in a black coat, short breeches, white stockings, and white gloves, was arranging crowns of roses about each of the dishes which was to be served up. Jean Valjean had charged him to explain his absence and gone away. Jean Valjean returned home. He lighted his candle and went upstairs. The apartment was empty. Toussaint herself was no longer there. Jean Valjean's step made more noise than usual in the rooms. All the closets were open. He went into Cosette's room. There were no sheets on the bed. The pillow, without a pillowcase and without laces, was laid upon the coverlets folded at the foot of the mattress, of which the ticking was to be seen, and on which nobody should sleep henceforth. All the little feminine objects to which Cosette clung had been carried away. There remained only the heavy furniture and the four walls. Jean Valjean looked at the walls, shut some closet doors, went and came from one room to the other. Then he found himself again in his own room, and he put his candle on the table. He approached his bed, and his eye fell, was it by chance or with intention, upon the inseparable of which Cosette had been jealous, upon the little trunk which never left him. On the 4th of June, on arriving in the Rue de l'Homme Armé, he had placed it on a candle-stand at the head of his bed. He went to this stand with a sort of vivacity, took a key from his pocket, and opened the valise. He took out slowly the garments in which, 10 years before, Cosette had left Montfermeil. First the little dress, then the black scarf, then the great heavy child's shoes, which Cosette could have almost put on still, so small a foot she still had. Then the bodice of a very thick fustian, then the knit skirt, then the apron with pockets, then the woolen stockings. Those stockings on which the shape of a little leg was still gracefully marked were hardly longer than Jean Valjean's hand. These were all black. He had carried these garments for her to Montfermeil. As he took them out of the valise, he laid them on the bed. He was thinking. He remembered. It was in winter, a very cold December. She shivered, half naked in rags, her poor little feet all red in her wooden shoes. He, Jean Valjean, had taken her away from those rags to clothe her in this mourning garb. The mother must have been pleased in her tomb to see her daughter wear mourning for her, and especially to see that she was clad and that she was warm. He thought of that forest of Montfermeil. They had crossed it together, Cosette and he. He arranged the little things upon the bed, the scarf next to the skirt, the stockings beside the shoes, the bodice beside the dress, and he looked at them one after another. She was no higher than that. She had her great doll in her arms. She laughed. They walked holding each other by the hand. She had nobody but him in the world. Then his venerable white head fell upon the bed. This old stoical heart broke. His face was swallowed up, so to speak, in Cosette's garments, and anybody who had passed along the staircase at that moment would have heard fearful sobs. Part 3. The formidable old struggle, several phases of which we have already seen, recommenced. Jacob wrestled with the angel but one night. Alas, how many times have we seen Jean Valjean clenched, body to body in the darkness with his conscience, and wrestling desperately against it? That night, however, Jean Valjean felt that he was giving his last battle. A poignant question presented itself. He had reached the last crossing of good and evil. He had that dark intersection before his eyes. This time again, as it had already happened to him in other sorrowful crises, two roads opened before him, the one tempting, the other terrible. Which should he take? The one which terrified him was advised by the mysterious indicating finger, which we all perceive whenever we fix our eye upon the shadow. The question which presented itself was this: in what manner should Jean Valjean comport himself in regard to the happiness of Cosette and Marius? This happiness, it was he who had willed it. It was he who had made it. He had thrust it into his own heart, and at this hour, looking upon it, he might have had the same satisfaction that an armourer would have who should recognize his own mark upon a blade, and withdrawing it all, reeking from his breast. Cosette had Marius. Marius possessed Cosette. They had everything, even riches, and it was all his work. But this happiness, now that it existed, now that it was here, what was he to do with it? He, Jean Valjean. Should he impose himself upon this happiness? Should he treat it as belonging to him? Should he put in his catastrophe as companion for their two felicities? Should he continue to keep silence? In a word, should he be, by the side of these two happy beings, the ominous mute of destiny? We must be accustomed to fatality in its encounter, to dare to raise our eyes when certain questions appear to us in their horrible nakedness. Good or evil are behind this severe interrogation point. What are you going to do? Demands the Sphinx. This familiarity with trial Jean Valjean had. He looked fixedly upon the Sphinx. He examined the pitiless problem under all its phases. Cosette, that charming existence, was the raft of this shipwreck. What was he to do? Cling on, or let go his hold? If he clung to it, he escaped disaster. He rose again into the sunshine. He let the bitter water drip from his garments and his hair. He was saved, he lived. If he loosed his hold, then the abyss. The obedience of matter is limited by friction. There is no limit to the obedience of the soul. If perpetual motion is impossible, is perpetual devotion demandable? The first step is nothing. It is the last which is difficult. What was the Champmathieu affair compared with Cosette's marriage and all that it involved? What was this, to return to the galleys, compared with this, to enter into nothingness? O first step of descent, how gloomy thou art! O second step, how black thou art! How should he not turn away his head this time? Martyrdom is a sublimation, a corrosive sublimation. It is a torture of consecration. You consent to it the first hour. You sit upon the throne of red-hot iron. You put upon your brow the crown of red-hot iron. You receive the globe of red-hot iron. You take the sceptre of red-hot iron. But you have yet to put on the mantle of flame. And there is no moment when the wretched flesh revolts, and you abdicate the torture? At last, Jean Valjean entered the calmness of despair. He weighed. He thought. He considered the alternatives of the mysterious balance of light and shade. His giddy reverie lasted all night. He remained there until dawn, in the same attitude, doubled over on the bed, prostrated under the enormity of fate, and crushed perhaps, alas. His fists clenched, his arms extended at a right angle, like one taken from the cross and thrown down with his face to the ground. He remained 12 hours, the 12 hours of a long winter night, chilled, without lifting his head, and without uttering a word. He was as motionless as a corpse, while his thought writhed upon the ground and flew away, now like the hydra, now like the eagle. To see him thus without motion, one would have said he was dead. Suddenly he thrilled convulsively, and his mouth, fixedly upon Cosette's garments, kissed them, and then one saw that he was alive. What one? Since Jean Valjean was alone, and there was nobody there. The one who is in the darkness.